thought it'd be useful to talk about Wen Ho Lee a little bit in this context, because in many ways he's an example of that. He's a very successful kind of mono-minority in a certain sense who came as a foreign student, married here, had children here, became a naturalized citizen, became quite successful, loving mathematics, really, worked on nuclear arms, you know, in Los Alamos. But then what happened to him, in some ways, I think has been quite a rude awakening for a lot of professionals, Asian Americans in this country.
You know, these racist and other factors, and often intermingled with international political conflict, are right below the surface. It doesn't take much for them to emerge. I mean, you know, look, I wouldn't be, let's take a hypothetical situation, closer to me personally. If the United States turned against Israel, which it could, there could be a major wave of anti-Semitism in the United States. It hasn't existed for maybe 30 years, but 40 years, but it could come back. It's all these things are barely below the surface.
There are a lot of Asian Americans who really come out of more kind of conservative backgrounds, so they're supporting U.S. foreign policy, but they find the contradiction when they're here in terms of they're being entirely vulnerable to racism, but also feeling quite vulnerable. I mean, many Chinese Americans believe that if there was a war with China or China was declared an axis of evil, they would be interned, just like the Japanese Americans,
It's not impossible. You know, it's not going to duplicate it, but the hysteria over China has been extreme. The Red Chinese were the super demons in the 1950s. All kind of fantasies concocted about what they're planning to do to Americans, you know, turn them into drug addicts. That particular thing was particularly ironic because it's the West that turned China into drug addicts by force, but that's been forgotten. Now there were fantasies about them going to turn us into drug addicts. And that could easily come back, just like the stories about Hispanic narco-traffickers were stimulated and built up in the late 80s, you know, mostly for domestic and international political reasons. And it doesn't take long. You know, I mean, these populations are very susceptible to that kind of propaganda. It's worth bearing in mind that for whatever reason, I don't know what the reason is, we can speculate, but the United States happens to be a very frightened society and has been for a long time. I mean, actually it goes back to colonial history, but in the modern period, it's dramatic. I mean, I remember my own children in school back around the early 60s being taught to hide under desks.
Duck and cover,
protect themselves from atom bombs, which are going to come from China probably, or Russia or someplace. There's no other, I don't think there's any other country in the world where any kind of such lunacy took place. But it's a strain that runs right through the culture and is always barely below the surface. It's a large part of the gun culture is based on that. I mean, plenty of people really think they need guns to protect themselves from, and you should see who they're protecting themselves from. I mean, there are parts of the country where people are protecting themselves from the United Nations, which is sending black helicopters over to carry out their plans of genocide of Americans, or aliens, you know, this fear of aliens. And of course, communists, whoever the current enemy happens to be. But these are strains that are just beneath the surface, and they can show up in very ugly ways.